into my first video for onlinechesslessons.net. For my first video, I thought I would share with you several games that I played in the C3 Sicilian, which is my favorite anti-Sicilian and an opening that I've gotten really good results with. Now, what's unusual about the games that I'm going to go over with you is that they were all won in 21 moves or less. And it's also quite unusual because they were all played in tournaments with slow time controls. I got the idea for this presentation from a game that I recently played just last week in the National Open in Las Vegas. And we're going to look at that one first. That one was Black played e4, c5, c3, knight f6, and then d5 later on. Next, we're going to look at e4, c5, c3, d5. But we're not going to spend too much time on those first two games because the main game that I want to get to is my win against Grandmaster Shabalov in the C3 Sicilian, which also took place in 21 moves and is a very instructional game. I'm hoping that these games will show you just how powerful the C3 Sicilian is and how careful you have to be if you're black. And hopefully it will also give you a sense of my teaching style and style of play in case I do more videos later on. Okay, so let's get started. This is my second round game from the National Open. I was white against a 2140 Lawrence Wuffley. 4, c5, c3. Now there are different ways to play against the Sicilian if you don't want to go into the open. The c3 Sicilian is my favorite because it's telling black that I'm still going to get control of the center, I'm still going to play d4 eventually, and it doesn't give black that satisfaction of getting the dynamic play that usually accompanies the open Sicilian. So the main ways to play against the c3 Sicilian are either with knight f6 or d5. My opponent played knight f6. Now this move makes sense because now that white committed to c3, white can't protect the e4 pawn by going knight c3, so black develops with an attacking move. White just attacks the knight again, similar to the Alekhine. Black goes knight d5. And now it's possible to go d4 immediately here. I personally prefer knight f3. Now, if you go d4, I just think it gives black more options because usually what happens is they take. You go knight f3. If you take back with the pawn, then they have this d6 move. And I prefer it if black puts the pawn on e6 instead because then their white bishop is blocked and you'll see that white's bishop is extremely powerful in the c3 Sicilian. So after knight f3, something like knight c6, bishop c4, knight b6, bishop d3, and black just has more options with this move order since they are temporarily a pawn up. So I like to play knight f3, and you can't really go wrong here because you're developing, and in the c3 Sicilian you see very rapid development for white, and that's what makes this opening so strong, is that in the meantime black is meandering on the queen side and white can really quickly get their pieces out. And it's a similar idea to what happens in the Rosalima, where white opens with knight f3 and bishop b5, very quick development. Knight c6, bishop c4. So some players will play e6, and we'll see my game against Shabalov later on, where we got that type of position. But here, since I didn't play d4, black has the opportunity to chase my bishop around. Knight b6. And the typical way of playing from this position for black is c4, bishop c2, queen c7, taking advantage of the fact that now that the pawn is on c4, I can't protect the pawn on e5. So white has to try and defend it for a bit, and then black has this move g5. Trying to deflect the knight from the e5 pawn. And white has several options on how to play on. Usually h3 or e6 are good alternatives. But instead my opponent opted for d5, which is somewhat of a hybrid of the knight f6 and d5 lines. I played knight a3. The other main move here is castles, but since black decided to bring his queen out early, then that's a good opportunity for me to develop my piece and then threaten it and support an early d4. Typically, black should play bishop e6 here, and after d4 you see the point of knight a3, because I would prefer to take back on d4 with the piece. I don't really want to have that isolated pawn structure. So the game will continue something like this. Black tries to go e5 to protect d4, again preventing me from getting that setup where I have a piece on d4. And d5 here, and that's a typical position. But instead my opponent played a6. And I can definitely see why he played that. The knight coming to b5 is definitely a threat, and it is scary for black, especially if you're not well versed in the theory. These types of setups are hard to play against. But for white, it's so easy. You just make simple, natural developing moves every time. Now I castle. Black plays bishop f5. And now is a good time for d4. So my opponent decides to play e6, and once again, just simple developing moves each time. But now I take back with the bishop. I don't have to take with the pawn. And my bishop is very powerful. Both of my bishops are aimed against the king. Now, despite my bishop attacking the pawn on g7, my opponent sets a trap for me. He goes bishop e7. And the idea is that if bishop takes g7, rook g8, now you would think that I have this intermediate move attacking the knight. However, black has another better move, bishop h3, with the idea of rook takes h2, which this bishop on d6 protects. And of course here black has a perpetual if he wants it, rook g2, rook h2, but he can play king d7 here, and now I'm in a lot of trouble because rook g8 is coming in. I have to play f4, but rook takes b2, and suddenly all of my pawns are just falling off the board, and black has a lot of compensation and initiative. But I don't have to take the pawn. I played queen f3, which renews the threat on g7, and at the same time attacks the pawn on b7, because the queen on f3 protects any of the bishop h3 threats. And now both of black's pawns are in prize, and he has to choose which one to defend. I think castling queen's side would have been better for black, but he chose to castle king's side. And that's understandable because the king does look a bit open on the queen's side. But now there's nothing stopping me from taking the pawn. It looks like my queen may be trapped here, but all of my pieces are coming into the center, and actually black's queen is the one that's in trouble. Black is trying to create some kind of attack on the king's side, but it's not going to work. I have this very powerful move here, knight e3, which serves multiple purposes. The first is, of course, protecting g2 just in case the bishop comes to e4, queen g5, bishop h3. But it also puts pressure on this d5 knight, which attacks this bishop on e7, which is under attack from my queen on b7, and at the same time it attacks black's bishop on f5, which he would of course prefer to keep. So of course if something like the nonchalant bishop e4, then I can just take the knight and take the bishop. So black has to be careful. He played bishop d6, which was immediately losing, and you'll see why in just a few seconds, but black's best try here would have been to take this knight. And then I take back with the bishop, and he just has to go and protect this bishop, and I'm up a pawn. But it's better than what happened in the game. After bishop d6, it looks like that's the right move. It looks like he got his bishop out of being attacked by the queen and is threatening mate on h2. However, I have g3. And black tried to go queen f3. He's still trying to go for the mate, but you can't attack with just two pieces. It's not going to work. I have a lot of defensive resources. Bishop d1. And suddenly you can see that black's queen doesn't have many squares. Queen e4. Bishop c2. Queen f3, but I'm not going to go for the perpetual here because after bishop takes f5, and this is move 21, black loses a piece here. He, of course, can't move this knight on d5, can't take my knight on e3, doesn't have any intermediate moves because his queen on f3 is pinned, and he doesn't have any checks for any sort of discovery. And of course, after he recaptures my bishop on f5, then I can take on d5 and force an exchange of queens. And I mean, that's it. That was the game. And my opponent was a formidable one. You wouldn't expect to win so quickly in 21 moves. But that's just the power of the c3 Sicilian. And it looked like black made very, very natural moves, but he got in trouble very quickly, and it all started to go downhill after a6, and that's easy to see in retrospect. But of course, when you're playing the game, you can't really tell that it's just snowballing into a worse and worse position every time. So that was definitely a welcome game because I came straight to Vegas from Los Angeles after work, so it was nice to have a very quick win after a very tiring trip over. Okay, let's look at my next game. Okay, this game was also in the slow time control tournament. This was just a local weekend quad. It took place about a month ago. Okay, here my opponent opted for knight c6, which is somewhat of a rare move, I would say. I mean, it's pretty innocuous. It gives white the flexibility to choose his own setup. I go for knight f3 because it preserves the option of e5 if he goes knight f6, and if he goes d5, then we get into the d5 lines of the c3 Sicilian. However, black's knight is on c6, whereas usually black wants the knight to be on f6 instead. And the reason why is very subtle, but it has to do with one of the main lines in the pawn snatching line, as it's called. And let me just show you what I mean. So if black plays d5, which is typically how this arises, knight f6 is the move here, knight f3, bishop g4. White's best option is to take on c5, and I know that if black is playing the Sicilian, they probably don't want to exchange queens early, but the best way to challenge white here is to exchange queens and try and win back the c5 pawn and take advantage of the fact that white's king is a bit exposed. So e5 is a good move. It opens up this attack on the c5 pawn, threatens e4. And after e4, white has to use this defensive maneuver. But because the knight is on f6, black has the option of taking on g4. You don't want to take this knight on f3 because white simply recaptures this bishop, and this king is in no trouble at all. Usually, if black can get a rook d8 check in, king c2, and bishop f5 or bishop g6, then white may be a bit worried. But now that that bishop is gone, white can just play on with that extra pawn, and white is better here. However, if the knight is on c6, then it's a bit of a different story. So we get to this position, and my opponent did not take the queen on d1, which was a big mistake, but if he had, then we would get into a similar position. Notice that the knight is on c6 and not on f6, so after this e4 move, then I can go g4 and get that favorable position again. And again, if you're not well versed in this theory, these type of subtleties are difficult to pick up on, because it looks like the knight on c6 is doing a lot. It's protecting, well, it's attacking the pawn on e5, and maybe it's allowing black to castle early. But of course, that's, it's not a glaring mistake or anything. It's just a bit of an inaccuracy. So here, instead of taking on d1, black made a very poor move, and once again, it's at this moment where black's position just started to deteriorate move by move, and it's only perceptible in retrospect. Black took the knight on f3, which was a big mistake. If he didn't want to exchange the queens on d1, he should have opted for taking on c5, even though I know that's not ideal because I can go bishop e3 and start chasing the queen. But after taking my knight on f3 and bringing this queen to f3, perhaps he was thinking that he wanted to take and double my pawns, but then he realized that if that happens, then he's not going to win the pawn on c5 back. So he took on c5 now. But of course, now my pieces can develop extremely easily and with threats, because black's queen is it just moved too far ahead in the opening too soon. I can go bishop e3 now, but instead I decided to play knight a3, and my reasoning was that I can go knight b5, threatening to go knight c7, and if I do that, black may be forced to defend that, and then bishop e3 will be more of a threat because black can't go to queen a5, where he would ideally want to move the queen back. And of course this move worked because, again, my opponent got worried about knight b5. Oh, and I should mention that my opponent here is a 2000 expert. So again, a formidable opponent. You wouldn't expect to win so quickly against an opponent expert or above. Okay, he played a6, and it prevents a knight b5 for the time being, but it really exposes the square on b6, which will prove pivotal in a few moves. Of course, bishop e3 is just begging to be played here. Again, you see these very simple, natural developing moves. Queen e5. Now, I mean, of course, if the queen is on e5, knight c4 is, again, begging to be played here. Queen f6, he keeps trying to exchange queens. Maybe he laments the fact that he didn't exchange queens before. Queen g3. It's move 11, and black has barely developed. Look at these pieces on the back rank. So he tries to go e5, get those pieces out. But after this, I'm already +2 here. And I mean, you wouldn't expect that e5 looks like a normal move. It looks like what black has to do. But I have knight b6, again taking advantage of the fact that he went a6 and left the b6 square very weak. And suddenly the rook looks trapped. It doesn't really have any squares to go to, because if it goes to rook d8 where it would like to go, then I go bishop g5. And you see the pin here, so he has to go rook b8, and I castle. Very simple, also a bit unexpected, but at the same time, look at this d file, and suddenly I'm threatening knight d7, forking the queen and the rook. It's a very unfortunate placement of the queen here because it prevents the rook from coming to d8, and it also puts itself under the prospect of falling into a fork with knight d7. It's very difficult for black to make any progress here. It's move 13, and his position is already falling apart. So he tries to develop bishop d6, which, immediately after seeing this move, I'm thinking there definitely have to be threats here, because this bishop is on d6. It's only protected by the queen, and all of black's pieces are all over the place. They're not coherent at all. Go queen g4, which has the powerful threat of queen d7 and winning the bishop on d6. So instead of putting the knight on d7, the queen coming to d7 is also a very strong threat. And now he goes rook d8, and there's not much else he can do to prevent the queen from coming to d7, so that move is almost forced. Now I get the chance to go bishop g5. He goes queen g6. I can't take the rook immediately because my own queen is hanging, but I have bishop d3, very simple, natural developing move, which also attacks the queen. And now the queen is forced to move, and then I can freely take the rook on d8. Queen's only move is to e6. Now I could probably take the queen now and then take the rook, but I have the chance to win another piece with bishop f5. Their queen takes a2. I can simply take on d8. In fact, the computer is saying that the best option for black here is to go knight f6 and just be a piece down. That's how strong my position is. So black takes on a2, but there are no perpetual checks there. I mean, I'm completely developed. My king is safe. This knight is useful in protecting this a4 square just in case I need to go to c2. And this bishop on f5 serves a very important function of covering the b1 square. After bishop takes d8, g6, I go bishop b1. And I won the exchange, and I'm also attacking black's queen, and he can't protect this bishop. He'll probably have to go back to e6, after which I take, and then I win the piece, and I'm up so much material that my opponent resigned on move 19. So, as you can see, again, very, very quick and powerful game. Okay, now the last game that I wanted to show you. This is probably my favorite game that I've ever played in a tournament, and of course my best game in the C3 Sicilian. And this just goes to show you that this opening doesn't just work against 2100s or 2000s. It's also very difficult for anyone to play against. You have to be extremely precise. Okay, so this is more of the main line. This is more, the typical move order that you see with e6 and d4. Okay, now here Grandmaster Shabalov played bishop e7, even though I think that the best setup here is to go knight b6, bishop d3, and then go for this bishop d7, bishop c6 maneuver, because black is going to try and get the bishop on the long diagonal anyway. But this is fine. So queen e2, I really like this line for white. It creates immediate threats on the b1 h7 diagonal, which can prove fatal, as we'll see. Okay, again, there are different ways to play this line, but knight c3 is my favorite because it challenges the knight on d5, which is really black's only asset in this position, and after he captures it, strengthens white's pawn chain. This is a typical move order, and black has two choices of where to put his queen. He can either go queen c7 or queen a5. Queen a5 is better, even though I already like this position for white, and I think it's so difficult to play with black unless you have, very specific and precise moves memorized. If you're just playing this, it's so easy to play for white, and in the meantime, the clock is running, and it's hard for black to find all the right moves. After queen a5, the idea is that if you go queen e4, then black has the sneaky queen a4 move, and white can't do typical plans with bishop d3. But if queen c7, then white can go queen e4, and the pawn on c3 is not attacked. So b6, now black tries to put the bishop on b7, which is what black should do on this line because the pawn on e6 blocks the bishop from coming out on that diagonal. But now I can get bishop g5 in, and it's mainly thanks to the fact that black decided to go b6 in this position. The idea, of course, is that if bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, I'm threatening mate, so he can't take on e5. But if he tries to take on e5, then I can go bishop takes e7. And if knight takes c4, I win the exchange. So if he takes on f3, I take back. After black takes on e7, I can win this rook. And that's why bishop g5 works here. So black goes bishop b7, which is what he intended to do. Now I go bishop d3. And you can see that if I started with bishop d3 instead of bishop g5 and try to go bishop g5 here, it wouldn't work because now there's no threat. And now if I take on a8, then because the queen is on c7 instead of taking the bishop on e7, my queen will get trapped. So that's why bishop g5 is very important. I'm not saying it's winning, but it does create pressure. Bishop b7, 3g6. And now the typical move would probably be queen h4 here. And after something like bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, h5, and I think black has a solid defense for the time being, and he's attacking the pawn on e5. So I decided to go for bishop f6. And what a beautiful square for the bishop. Why not put it there? The pawn on e5 is extremely powerful in the c3 Sicilian, as you've probably noticed from other games. And it's definitely doing its job by supporting this strong piece on f6. Of course, I would like for him to take on f6 and get rid of this bishop, but I don't want to take the bishop on e7 immediately because this bishop on f6 is creating enough threats on its own. And even though the bishop is on f6, there aren't any immediate direct mates or threats here, so black can simply develop. And queen e3, that's a very quiet move, but at the same time, you can already see that I have my eye on bringing the queen to h6, and it also gets the queen out of the way of any discoveries by black's knight on c6. Black continues with his plan of trying to take control of the d-file. And I want to move my queen out, but my bishop on d3 is attacked, and since queen h6, there's no mate there because of bishop f8, I decide to also develop my pieces, bring all of my pieces in, rook a d1. Now black tries to go knight a5 and take control of the c4 square and attack on c3. But even though it seems like white's attack has slowed down a bit with the last few moves, that's not the case at all. I'm just preparing for a different setup because I go knight g5 here. And it's really interesting that the knight gets supported by the bishop from the front rather than having the bishop be on c1 or d2 as is usually the case. And already you can see that the knight on g5 is creating threats to the pawn in h7, f7, e6. It's extremely strong there. And in the meantime, black doesn't have any sort of counterplay. So if black plays rook d8 here, which is probably what he intended to do originally, then thanks to the knight on g5, I can go queen h3. And after h5, because I'm threatening to checkmate on h7, I can take on e6. And black's best option is to go for this line where I end up being an exchange on the pawn up. Because if he takes on e6, if he takes the knight on e6, then there's a mate in 7 here. And this is the ideal in the c3 Sicilian. If you can get this, this is just emblematic of the c3 Sicilian piece attack. Yeah, very nice geometrical motifs here. Also, if black goes king f7, we have this mate. So definitely a lot of threats, a lot of fireworks. So black decides to take on f6, probably relieve himself of any of those threats, and now play rook d8. And now queen h3 is probably still good, but there's an even better move here. And this is the point in the video where you should pause and see if you can find what the winning move is that made the Grandmaster resign. And the answer is knight e4. Yeah, very surprising because the knight is moving back, and that's actually opening the queen up to this mate on h6. And the beauty of knight e4 is that black, would usually like to try and put the queen on f8 to prevent that mate, but the knight stops the queen from coming in. And black has no intermediate moves. In fact, black's best chance is to go king f8 here. But of course, I'm in exchange and 2 pawns up, including a very strong passed pawn up, so he didn't want to go for that, and he resigned after knight e4. And, I could go into all of these games into more depth. They have a lot more variations, a lot more subtleties to them. But I thought this would give you a good taste of the C3 Sicilian, and, these games aren't published, so, you should take note of them, and, I hope that you enjoyed them. And you definitely should explore the C3 Sicilian if you haven't already. If you're like me, then you keep up with chess and you want to keep playing in tournaments, but you don't have time to keep up with all the theory. And the C3 Sicilian is the perfect opening because you can simply just play based on plans and systems and setups, and there's little memorization. In fact, my theory ended around move 13, queen e4. This is as far as I knew, and the rest of it is very simple to calculate because all the moves come natural. I'm in law school now. I don't really have much time to learn all that the open Sicilian has with it. So the C3 Sicilian has served me very well, and I hope you learned a lot from this, and please let me know if you would like me to cover any other topics or events. Thanks. I hope I can do this again.